you might be growing up in a household that's chaotic, that people are not treating you well, and so you don't think you deserve to be treated well because nobody's ever treated you well. And so then if you meet someone that treats you well, you could panic.
So, next I want to get into some communication red flags. So, say you've been dating someone, you're not officially, as you guys would call it, pinned, you're not steady yet. What are some communication red flags that to be wary of?
I think that you need to understand that it's more than just your words. If you're speaking, it's more your tone of voice than it is the actual words, because that has a much deeper emotion to it, as well as remember that longer. You know, people will look at this and they'll hear the tone of voice that we use much longer, and they'll remember that than what the words were that we said. And so basically, you have to understand the limitations of what words do in communication. The other thing is so important is you got to know how to be a good listener. Because there's an adage that basically says, I know that you heard what I said, but what I said is not what I mean. So that shows you all the pitfalls that can happen if you're just using words to try to get and convey an idea.
There's something that I've used a lot in counseling, and it's just two words to remember: respond, don't react.
Ooh.
Because
ooh, that's so good.
So often people will say something and it hits a button and you want to go.
Yeah, just whatever.
And you need to think about it, and you need to respond to what's being said. Maybe even ask some questions. I think I heard you say such and such. Is that what you really mean? Or it's perfectly all right to say, I'm feeling hurt by that comment, or I'm feeling angry or frustrated. And if you have those feelings, you need to express them, not bury them.
Yeah, that's so true, because I know different people have different ways of processing things, because some people might be like, hey, I don't just react, I do keep my temper. But if they bury it, then that's all going to be bundled in. It's all going to come out at some horrible time.
That's right.
And they might say some things that they regret, even if during the moment they were able to, keep it together. So that's...
And if you really do have any of those feelings, you need to get them out so that you can talk about them, instead of stuffing them, like you say, and having a Vesuvius moment.
Yeah.
What goes along with that is a very important part of communication, and that is what we call I statements instead of you statements.
Okay.
You take ownership for what you're saying, and you don't accuse the other one. Instead of thinking that makes me very upset, you don't go and say, you make me mad. See the tone of voice? The words are very accusatory, and that puts somebody on the defensive, instead of what you want to do in communication is keep the conversation going so that you can find out, are we agreement on this, or is there something there that is getting in the way and being an obstacle to what we're talking about?
And in that same vein, if you realize that you have misspoken or reacted in a poor way, you should immediately say, I really blew it. I didn't mean what I said. I hope, will you please forgive me for that reaction that I had? And let's talk about this some more, but be willing to take blame. If you've done something that is not right, ask for forgiveness. Bring it up right away, and that's another thing that you could stuff, and it's just not good.
Yeah, I think what I'm hearing so much in this communication is humility, discipline, and transparency. You know, you have to recognize it takes two to tango. Neither of us are perfect. We're never going to say everything perfectly, but to
Right.
take ownership of it, to have the discipline to not explode, to say everything you feel whenever you feel it,
Mm-hmm.
and then yeah, this is so good.
What people do is they will pick up very soon on whether there's a genuine desire to understand what the other person believes. Or do you feel that somebody's trying to manipulate you from what you are giving off as what you think to what they want you to believe? And that's something that is kind of subtle, but it can jump right out at you. And nobody wants to be manipulated. They want to arrive at their own conclusions based on facts, not on what somebody else is telling them they should believe.
What are some red flags with dealing with parents and or the in-laws, not necessarily your in-laws yet, but the parents of who you're dating? What are some red flags that you should watch out for?
One big one is if there hasn't been a releasing of the person that you're dating, if the parents are still hanging on to their relationship with him or her, and you know, we've seen situations where parents don't want their daughter to follow her husband in his new job because it takes her away from them.
That's real.
It's very, and sometimes that girl will go unwillingly, and she will have to talk to her mother every day, you know, check in and make sure. And we call that leaving. You need to leave your parents and cleave to your spouse.
Yes.
And you know, if you feel like you haven't been released yet, you need to talk to your parent about that. You need to say, you know, I feel like I'm still your child. You're still wanting to tell me what to do. And I would like for us to have an adult relationship where we can speak in an adult way to each other and tell each other the truth as adults and talk about it and accept it. And
As a father of girls, I wanted to meet the guys that my daughters were dating. I wanted to know what his intentions were, and I could tell just by his willingness to come and meet us as parents. You know, I'm amazed at some that the parents didn't even meet the
young man or woman.
young man or woman, the engaged couple that was not their child, until the guy came and asked if he could marry his daughter.
He's like,
It's a
I don't
little
even
late.
know you.
That's a little late to get to introduce yourself to somebody for the first time.
I'm surprised, like, that someone would do, because I feel like at that point, I wouldn't even think you would ask for permission at that point, like, because you clearly see yourselves as two, you know.
In charge.
Yeah, so that surprises me that happens, but I guess clearly, as you've just mentioned, it does.
Well,
Wow.
the girls knew that I expected to meet any young man that they were going out with, because he needed to know that his parents, we were very interested in who she had for a guy friend. And it worked out well because our daughters felt they had an umbrella of protection from their parents as opposed to just being out there and depending on friends or themselves to navigate that relationship.
What would you say to individuals who they know their parents well enough to know that whoever they're dating will not fit the mold of what their parents want, whether that be their parents wanted them to be with a high-paying guy and this guy's just a regular working dude, or they wanted them to marry within their own specific culture and this person is outside of that, and they know that if they bring him home, this person may face, like, I'll just say it like classism or racism if they bring him home, because I know that's a really real thing. It's not necessarily that they're ashamed of who they're bringing home, but they're afraid that their own family will hurt this person to some extent. Like, how should someone navigate that sort of situation?
Now that's hard. That's very hard because you've got a lot of feelings.
You have to decide what kind of a relationship you want with your parents after you're married. And if you're going to go your own way, then basically you can ignore anything that anybody else tells you, but realize that you're on your own. Don't expect to go back and cry on your parents' shoulder about what you didn't do that you should have, and I'm sorry and all that. Hey, you made your bed, now lie in it.
Well, and I think this kind of goes back to something that we talked about before, and that is having an adult relationship with your parent, so that you can say, I know this is not the person that you would have chosen for me to marry, and yet we're in love, and we seem to bring the best out in each other, and we seem to be a good fit. Would you be happier about the situation if we had some premarital counseling, or if there are some steps you can take to kind of help the parents relax about it? Now, if there's a real bias, it's not going to matter. Sometimes you just have to say, I guess we have to agree to disagree, and I'm going to go ahead with this. And as Grandpa said, then you have to live with that decision.
And it sounds like create those boundaries to protect this new family.
Right.
Because if you are navigating an area where your parents, no matter what, because there are also honestly some parents where it's not even like classism or racism, they just don't like the fact you're with their kid. Like, there's just
Right.
not who you were. Like,
Right.
They just don't like it, that to create those boundaries with your parent where you create the parameters. I'm like, if you want to be involved in our lives, this is when you can come. This is when you can call. This is when this can happen. If you don't, then don't. It's kind of like having that type of adult relationship that you're saying, where you have to do what you have to do to not shut them out, but yes, these are the consequences, as Grandpa said. These are the consequences of dealing with your parents, but you create the rules for how you want this dynamic to be.
Right, because this person is my highest priority. Once I'm married, we're each other's highest priority, and our parents are important, but we want to honor our parents, but we don't have to obey everything they want us to do now, because we're adults and we're responsible for our own behaviors. And so sometimes I think you have to have that kind of a conversation. And sometimes you're surprised. Sometimes you think something's going to happen and that they're not going to be happy, and then they are.
You never know what that journey, that the parents could still be growing, and that the parents' own, like, I think, at least as a young adult, I have to recognize that my parents and my grandparents are still evolving, and who they were when I was 12 is not who they are now at my current age.
Right.
And to give your parents the grace of, they can change and grow too, but I won't let you hurt my family. I won't let you hurt my husband. I won't let you hurt my wife or my kids. Like, we're not going to do that. So, very cool. What are some lifestyle red flags that you notice with couples?
One thing that we noticed with some couples is that one of them would come from a family that spent everything they had. They lived to the end of their income, and they had credit card debt, and they brought takeout home for dinner every night, and their lifestyle was ridiculous. And at one point we did premarital for a couple who the wife's family was like that, and the husband's family was as conservative as they could. They made their own clothes, they built their own house, they had their own garden, they grew their food, and they never had a debt. And we knew when we were going to do premarital with them that we had to really help them see the differences in their family and choose the lifestyle, something in between,
Yeah.
that they wanted. And they were able to do that. It doesn't always happen, but we did a lot of role playing, and we really tried to think of problems that they might have. But that's a big red flag if you grew up in a home that's very different than the home that your spouse grew up in.
Yeah, and sometimes it takes getting outside of your circle to kind of realize that, because for most people, the fact that like they made their own clothes, like that sounds crazy to me, but to him, if most of the people he grew up with did that, he might not realize that's so conservative.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
you have to be outside of what your immediate circle is to recognize that. Very cool.
Do you have anything?
I think the finances is the biggest thing to overcome.
Finances.
Yeah, because in relationships, that is a big hurdle for a lot of couples, because their saving and spending habits can be on a continuum that's so diverse that it's hard to bridge that, because it takes a certain amount of income in order to establish a lifestyle that is sustainable. And if you keep coming to the end of your paycheck and not having time yet till the next one shows up, and you're always living on the edge from the standpoint of, can I afford this, can I not afford this, that's when people start using credit cards for their emergency spending. And then they can't pay off the credit card, and then all of a sudden they're in a debt that is designed to last until you're 72 years old.
For some people, talking about finances is so taboo, and when you're in love, you don't want the money to matter. Like, and I think it's not coming from people don't want to sound like they're coming from a shallow place, because I think when people initially talk about money, they don't want us to come across as like a gold digger or looking for a sugar mama, or like we have all these like negative terms for what that is, so people don't want to talk about it, when really talking about it is just another part of growth as a person, and money's just a tool for kind of making the moves that you want and having a life that you want, and being on the same page is important. Grandma, Grandpa, what's how women treat men red flags?
Well, I think if you grew up in a matriarchal household where mother was in control, after you're married, you think that's the way marriage should go. And that could cause a lot of problems, because your spouse might not be happy with your telling him what to do. And so you really have to know each other well, and not try to be in charge. I think trying to be in control either way is probably a problem. If you want to call all the shots and lay things out the way you want them to be, that's a red flag, because you're not working together.
I think one of the things you girls need to remember is guys do not want to have another mother. You're his wife, not his mother. And don't try to make him into something that you want him to be, that he wasn't when you started dating and had the idea, well, I'll make him into who I want him to be. Ain't going to work, honey.
Well, I that is a real thing, too. I think any woman who's felt like she's had to be a mother will start to kind of resent that, because it's exhausting. It's exhausting to feel like you have an additional child who's a grown man you're sleeping with. Like, that's not something a lot of women want. I will say, I remember I did a video one time about different kinds of marriage and how some people get married thinking they're going to build this woman or build this man into what they want. And so then they might start to feel that kind of like having to mother him to make him into this person, when I'm like, in the video I was like, yeah, you can't do that. Like, they have to grow organically as well. You can't like shift them into your perfect
little mold.
That's not how people work, and that's not cool to do either. So any men treating women but red flags, like if there's some habit, you already kind of said, if one person is bossing the other person around, either way, it's just, that's not cool. But
temper is a huge thing. And in many marriages, usually it's the guy who's angry about something, probably not even something that happened, but he takes it out on his wife, and that's where abuse comes in. Sometimes it's verbal abuse, but sometimes it's physical too. If you are angry and take it out on your spouse, that is a big red flag.
Yeah.
Another one that's a little more subtle, but unless it's happening to you, and that's where you sense that the other one always has to have the last word. That way it sounds like this is a win-lose type of thing. And in marriage, it's got to be win-win. You both get something better out of it because you're together, as opposed to always being on opposite sides and having to feel that you were the one who won the battle, because battles do not build, they tear down.
Yeah, I heard a saying one time from a married couple, and they said that it's us against the problem. Like, it's not me against you, it's us against whatever this issue is. So we need to identify the issue and then work this out. For someone in our audience who they're in a place in their life where they recognize, man, I've only ever had really broken relationships, whether it be abusive or they just tolerated a lot of stuff they shouldn't, or maybe they were the abuser, or they had a time in their life where their family is a mess, and they know that they don't know how to have a healthy relationship, but they don't know where to start. What steps should that person start so that way they could have a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage?
I think a lot of people try to get into a relationship before they've learned how to be a good friend. And a good friend is not self-centered and self-absorbed. You give off the thing that you really care about other people. And usually when a relationship breaks up, it's because somebody has grown weary of self-centeredness and self-absorption in the other person that they're trying to have a relationship with. It's hard to have good friends if you're so wrapped up in yourself that you come across as only caring about what you want, when you want it, and how you want it. So you have to look at, why did these relationships fail? Look for a common thread that basically says, oh, I gave off this message again, or I said these things, or, it's not so much what you say as how you come across to people. And if somebody grows weary of that, then they're going to end that relationship.
Okay, so you recognize the ownership of your own relationship where you find faults, and then ask yourself, was I selfish in these relationships? Well, some people, Grandpa, to be the devil's advocate here, maybe they gave a whole lot of energy to somebody who didn't love them and who didn't nurture them. Maybe they were loving the selfish person, and they find this habit in their life of, I keep loving people and they don't love me back, and I feel used all the time. Because there's that kind of brokenness too, where they might not necessarily be the selfish one, but they don't seem to love themselves enough to recognize that they should be treated better.
What we really come back to is what we've talked about before, is how you need a faith base. You need help beyond yourselves. And I don't, you could find that maybe in another couple that has a good marriage. You might be able to sit down and talk things through with them. You might go to a pastor. You might get help there. You might not.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because if you don't know what love is, and if God is love, then how are you supposed to love yourself? And if you don't love yourself, you're going to tolerate poor behavior from other people.
You're going to expect it.
You might even expect it if that's how your parents treated you, if that's how all your ex-girlfriends and boyfriends treated you, then
you get to a place where you say, I don't deserve any better than that because I'm so awful.
I think we have to back up and recognize where relationships really began in our life. You're in a situation of the relationships are based on blood, on who your parents are, who your siblings are. you start to get into a dating relationship, now all of a sudden it's a little different because there's choice involved. When you're part of a family, you are in that family whether you want to be or not because you're flesh and blood. When you get into relationships that now are a matter of choice instead of defined by blood and who your parentage is, that takes on a whole different dynamic than when you grew up in a family. And you have to understand that when it's a choice that other people make as well as you, then you have to behave differently. And I think some people have trouble going from expectation of what the relationship was like all their life so far until now we're in a new one.
So that's so good to hear you say that, okay, there's now, when you're choosing who to be with, you have the option to have a different life than what
Exactly.
your parents had. You have that choice. And so if you're from the combined answers from what I'm hearing from you guys is that if you're of a faith base where you learn what love is, and then you love yourself, you come to a place of you know how you should be treated, and then you can make a choice as to who you're with someone who loves
Exactly.
you and brings the best out in you.
Exactly.
But it sounds like it takes like a lot of self-work, a lot of understanding where you came from and self-reflection and growth before you're even really in a place that you could navigate a healthy relationship, because otherwise you might just fall back into the patterns of the people who brought you up, which may or may not be healthy.
Right. And that, you know, that's the situation. You might be growing up in a household that's chaotic, that you know, people are not treating you well, and so you don't think you deserve to be treated well because nobody's ever treated you well. And so then if you meet someone that treats you well, you could panic. You could go, you know, I'm so used to living in this situation where I don't know what's going to happen next. And now this person is so kind and loving and helpful. I don't know if I deserve this. And so maybe they can't continue with that relationship because of what went on in the past.
They might think that there's a catch because it felt like that before, but then that person turned around and and used them or choose the intimate use the intimate conversations that we'd had, and then they turned it around and used my words against me and made me look ashamed. And so when you meet there's a lot of it can be hard if there's already that distrust there.
That's
like,
right.
How do I move forward with this?
And you can see how important it is to understand yourself before you're going to be in a relationship that you're going to understand.
So good. What is your opinion upon changing for a partner? I did a video recently about like how there could be positive changes and negative changes and values and beliefs and that stuff. And I think people have different ideas of what that should be. And I'm talking about changing, because people are always changing no matter what, but changing like your partner wants you to gain weight or lose weight or change your personal style. They want you to do your hair different. They want you to change your job and aspirations. Like those things that are kind of personal to you, like the things you came into the relationship with. What do you think about that?
I don't think it's necessary.
Well, it depends on what level of change you're looking for. If it's a core belief that you have, a value that you have in life, and they're asking you to change that, that's pretty difficult.
Oh, yeah.
But if it's kind of superficial and it really isn't that important, that's where this whole idea of conflict resolution comes in. And that's a whole other topic altogether. But where you're trying to work out differences that you're bringing into a relationship, that is one of the most important things that you can do, because if you don't do it up front, it's going to rear its head later on, and then you're going to have to deal with it, or it's going to break the relationship. So basically the idea is it's not your job to remake the other person.
That's good.
If you're not willing to accept them for who they are, don't expect that they're going to want to be fashioned into something that you want.